Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Gomez and I'm the Assistant Director of the Environmental Studies Program at Tufts University. And it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to the Hoke Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series, which is made possible thanks to the generosity of Tufts alumni, Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke. I would also like to thank this week Dr. Amal Bishara and the Anthropology Department for co-sponsoring today's event. And if you are curious to see what other talks are coming up, although this semester we just have one more, and we're already working for another exciting semester. But if you want to receive alerts of these talks, or if you're a student want to receive our weekly newsletter for students, feel free to sign up in the link that we'll put in the chat. And also to see the fall schedule and the spring semester. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. The chat is deactivated, so you won't be able to type anything there. But if you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Or if you want to say them out loud, you can raise your hand at the end of the talk, and we will allow you to use your voice. So this meeting is being recorded. And if you want to access the recording, you can check our website in a week or two, or you can send me an email if you need it before that. And now to introduce today's speaker, Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins, we have Dr. Bishara.
Thank you so much. I want to appreciate all of your work, Sarah, in putting this series together and bringing us all together for this talk. And a very big thanks for Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins for joining us today. I want to start today briefly by acknowledging that Tufts Somerville Medford campus is located on the unceded territories of the Massachusetts and Pennacook tribal nations, and to acknowledge the horrific history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. I also want to honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. As members of the Tufts community, and especially because we're geographically dispersed this year, we can acknowledge that many of us occupy or have occupied unceded lands of other Indigenous nations as well. And we can recognize also the interconnectedness among Native American nations historically and contemporarily, and that Native connections to land are complex and can change over time while remaining strong and vital. We're also in the area of what was once a slaveholding estate called the 10 Hills Plantation. And it's crucial to recognize that Tufts benefited politically and economically from the systems of slavery that cultivated Massachusetts and other states. This history of dispossession and exploitation and the contemporary presence of Indigenous communities should inform an approach to learning and action at Tufts and beyond. We know that land acknowledgement is only one small step in larger processes of building towards justice and working towards decolonization. And I'm sure that you all can think of others, particularly through the lens of environmental studies. It is a deep, deep pleasure to introduce Professor Stamatopoulou-Robbins today. She is an anthropologist whose research centers around infrastructure, discard studies, science and environment, climate change, colonialism, austerity, the sharing economy, the Middle East, and Europe. Her first book, Besieged, The Life of Infrastructure in Palestine, published by Stanford University Press in 2019, explores what happens when, as Palestinians are increasingly forced into proximity with their own wastes and with those of their occupiers, waste is transformed from matter out of place into matter with no place to go. Her book, for me, has opened up a profound sense of the political today for Palestinians and others as we grapple with waste, the rule or neglect of bureaucracies and everyday struggles to be moral. I've already enjoyed reading and teaching this book on multiple occasions. It's such a creative and generative and important book that gets to the heart of so much of political experience for Palestinians and for all of us today. And it's an incredible accomplishment also that has been recognized by the wonderful Middle East Studies Association Albert Harani Book Award. So big congratulations for that as well. I'm also excited for her new book project about Airbnb, transforming the relationship between subjectivity, real estate, and work in Greece. But I realized that we are actually shorter on time than I realized perhaps when I started to write this introduction. So I'll stop there and just say a big thank you and welcome to Professor Stamatopoulou-Robbins.
Thank you so much, Professor Gomez and Professor Bishara, for these introductions and extremely generously inviting me. I also just want to appreciate the land acknowledgement and slavery acknowledgement that you began with. And I would like actually to get in touch with you later to think about how I can adapt something similar to my place here in the Hudson Valley and Bard College area. So thank you all for being here today. I think I want to share my screen before I forget that very important part of this. Let me get us on the play route. Just a moment. All right. I think that's working. So thank you all for being here today and for this invitation to speak at Tufts. I'm excited also that this is available to the broader community, and I hope we'll have a lively discussion after my talk. Okay, so I begin with the premise that Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank are surrounded by what for Palestinian society are unprecedented types and volumes of waste that are inescapable. I call this condition a waste siege, and I argue that this emergent yet overlooked siege shapes politics and ethics in Palestine in unexpected ways. Unwanted things are important actors, mediating and complicating life at multiple scales. I conducted fieldwork between 2007 and 2016, with a continuous 2.5-year stay between 2009 and 2012. My book posits waste as worlding and contingent, and therefore proposes that even in a place where life is dominated by settler colonial militarism and neoliberal statecraft, that domination and experiences of it are both mediated by historically specific forms and ways of managing refuse. Today, I'll discuss two features of waste siege. In the first part, I'll talk about circularity to demonstrate why I think siege is an apt term for how waste works in Palestine. In the second part, I'll discuss how infrastructures and what I call infrastructural forms help us understand waste siege. One of my arguments about infrastructure is that it is generative, often because it proliferates problems rather than making them go away. The three examples on which I draw are: one, the Palestinian Authority's first West Bank sanitary landfill; two, waste dumping in the village of Shukba; and three, bread abandoned out of doors. Together, these examples show how waste besieges different people differently and at different scales. Before going on, I'd like to provide some historical context. Palestine's waste siege resulted from a historical conjuncture in the past 2 decades in particular. When Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, it took over Palestinians' healthcare, education, infrastructure, and economy. In the mid-1990s, Israel signed an agreement in Oslo with the Palestine Liberation Organization that, among other things, created the Palestinian Authority, which today I'll be referring to as the PA. Israel maintained full military control over the territory, while the PA became responsible for Palestinian civilian life, including waste management on fragments of it. As you can see in this map, these fragments amount to roughly 30% of the West Bank and are non-contiguous. The PA has never been able to create adequate distance between the roughly 3 million West Bank Palestinians and wastes, be that Palestinians' own wastes or Israeli-produced wastes. Part 1, circularity. The phrase waste siege conveys a sense of surroundedness, a sense that life without wastes is inconceivable. My formulation complicates the definition of waste as matter out of place, as some have defined it following anthropologist Mary Douglas's famous definition of dirt, which renewed the argument of philosopher and psychologist William James that dirt was a matter of classification. For Palestinians, waste is not so much out of place as it is matter with no place to go. It remains present even when it changes form or location. Picture a piece of used toilet paper in a windowless prison cell. You can crumple it, step on it, rip it apart, or even eat it. But you cannot, in a meaningful sense, get rid of it. This makes waste siege generative. Any attempt to address the ethical, political, or practical dilemmas that waste creates, or equally to capitalize on the opportunities it opens up, results in the redistribution and reformulation of waste's dilemmas rather than in their eradication. The PA's first West Bank sanitary landfill demonstrates how waste in Palestine besieges, even in what we might think of as the ideal scenario, when an infrastructure is successfully erected to dispose of it en masse. Under strong encouragement from its international donors, on whom most of its budget depends, the PA opened the landfill in 2007. In many ways, Zahrat al-Finjan landfill looks like a typical landfill that could be anywhere. It could be in any one of the dozens of countries like the US, where waste burial is standard practice. It is a crater cut into a piece of agricultural land south of Jenin. It occupies roughly 44.5 acres and is surrounded by a fence. After a metal gate and booth, the landfill's entrance features a bridge where truck drivers stop to have the contents of their vehicles weighed and evaluated for quality and type. They haul municipal wastes of about 1 million Palestinians here from the northern and central West Bank. Beneath piles of garbage, the crater is covered with 2 layers of polyethylene liner that create a membrane blocking liquids from seeping downward as organic refuse and rots and combines with air moisture. The membrane catches the liquids called leachate at the bottom of the pile. Plastic pipes channel leachate to a pond at one edge of the landfill. Landfills are the most common method of waste disposal worldwide, popular because they make waste absent from certain places, allowing large agglomerations of people to live together and making relatively waste-free lives reproducible. Landfills allow people not to think about their trash. But unlike many other contexts where landfills are uncharismatic, unspectacular infrastructures, even for those who manage them, in Palestine, they carry a surprising, if dirty and contested, sheen. The Oslo negotiations had implied that the PA would eventually turn into a Palestinian state, but only if it could demonstrate its readiness for statehood to the international community, including Israel. Readiness, I learned, includes evidence that the PA will protect the environment, which the Accords framed as an environment shared between Israel and the PA. This sharedness of the environment became justification for continued Israeli involvement in Palestinian waste management and generated an imperative for Palestinians to construct sanitary infrastructures. Since its establishment, the PA has thus sought to use landfills to replace long-standing garbage management systems comprised of hundreds of smaller dump sites that were unlined and that were frequently burned. For the previous roughly 130 years, at least since the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms in the late 19th century, each municipality or village had moved what little refuse was not siphoned off for reuse as animal feed or fertilizer or burned to heat public bathhouses, horizontally across the land's surface from residential centers to administrative peripheries. Zahrat al-Finjan centralized waste disposal by forcing over 85 municipalities to close local dump sites and to haul wastes to the landfill instead. In doing so, the PA made municipal waste its de facto property, rendering waste public at a national scale, and the PA itself all the more state-like for serving as custodian of the nation's wastes. What anthropologists Nikhil Anand, Akhil Gupta, and Hannah Apple call the promise of infrastructure that Zahrat al-Finjan offered was evident in the everyday affects and activities of its managers. Promoting landfills for Palestine, which they did, among other things, through YouTube videos like the one in this image and through Facebook posts, was what Hamdi and Mu'tasim referred to as national Watani work. Zahrat al-Finjan often seemed like more of a calling than a job. It was a historic, unique opportunity to transform Palestine's physical environment, to create visible signs of statehood, and to work on Palestine at the albeit much reduced national scale. It meant modernizing protection of Palestine's environment through large-scale sanitary infrastructures. Preventing fires and dioxins from entering people's lungs made them sanitation pioneers in an undeveloped, disorderly landscape. Doing national work also meant impressing donors and Israeli officials who were always understood to be watching. Zahrat al-Finjan was, in these senses, a way for PA employees to perform what historian Dominique Laporte calls the transformation of shit into gold. Yet in other ways, the landfill was also toxic. It compressed thousands of tons of trash together in one place, risking human health and water sources. For example, if leachates leak into water supplies beneath the landfill. Landfills also devour land. They're one of the few infrastructures that grow in size over time. They're designed to constantly consume more waste, which in turn alters possible land use, not only in the immediate vicinity, but also further afield. Given that Israel adds new Jewish-only housing in the West Bank nearly every day, using private agricultural land to store garbage was anathema to the ethical positions of many engineers like Hamdi and Mu'tasim, who nevertheless made the decision to do so. Waste burial is also toxic because it is not quite as modern as everyone said it was. And its chief proponents, Hamdi and Mu'tasim included, knew that very well. These men were among Palestine's first expert waste managers trained abroad or in recently established environmental engineering departments in Palestinian universities. They knew that there were other newer technologies such as heat coupling incinerators, like the one depicted here, that were possibly more appropriate for Palestine. Incinerators need less land because they transform waste into usable materials, and they can generate energy. This energy part is particularly significant given that Palestinians are currently forced to purchase electricity from Israel. Hamdi and Mu'tasim also knew that landfills are being banned elsewhere, including in countries like Germany that were funding new Palestinian landfills. Finally, landfills are financially toxic. Zahrat al-Finjan had been built on a $9 million World Bank loan that was now due. The only way to pay it back was from the tipping fees. For communities that had previously been dumping on local, free, or cheaply rented land, hauling wastes across greater distances required higher fuel and maintenance costs for larger trucks, making waste disposal much more expensive. Many municipalities simply could not pay or refused to do so. Having closed dozens of municipal dump sites, however, Zahrat al-Finjan's operators could not reject municipal trucks that could not pay. Doing so would produce unregulated trash pileups all over again. Plus, residents already critical of the PA would be watching, as would donors and Israel. Here lies the circularity of waste siege. One way that Zahrat al-Finjan's operators improvised to pay back the loan was by increasing the number of people whose waste was disposed of there from 200,000, for which the landfill had been designed, to 600,000, and then finally 1 million, hoping that other communities would pay and help cover the non-paying communities' costs. Suddenly, the landfill accepted waste from as far south as Ramallah, 2 hours away. But inviting unplanned for waste disposal meant that the landfill's lifespan was abruptly and irreversibly reduced from 30 years down to 15. Israeli prohibition on incineration and donor concerns that Palestinians lack the know-how to manage incinerators means that landfills are Palestinians' only current large-scale waste disposal option. A prematurely full landfill would thus force operators to expand the landfill sooner than expected. To slow the rate at which the landfill was building up, the operators prohibited bulky construction and demolition wastes. To temper the landfill's environmental risks and public concerns they raised, Operators also prohibited animal carcasses and medical wastes from the landfill. I'll return to the effects of this in part 2. Here, I want to emphasize that in compressing wastes to mitigate one set of dilemmas, Zahat al-Finjan proliferated new waste-related dilemmas, enlisting new sets of actors to engage them. The dilemmas created and actors enlisted were specific to the properties, both physical and semiotic, of both the wastes and the infrastructures designed to manage them. And importantly, all choices in relation to Zahat al-Finjan were ambivalently made. In fact, one way to read my book, I would say, is as an ethnography of ambivalence. One site experiencing surprising ambivalence is Shukba, a village of about 5,000 people. It's a 40-minute drive from Ramallah and surrounded by Israeli installations and trash mountains. As you drive through Shukba, car parts and metal parts of beds, office chairs, and refrigerators are the roadside attractions. Sari, the secretary of Shukba's village council, took me through Shukba's valley in 2012. When we entered the village, my lungs clenched, inhaling air choked with trash fire smoke. Sari explained that residents set fire to the dumps to try to shrink them. When they do, dumps burn for 3 or 4 months on end, even when it rains. The smoke hung low over the houses, and we also smelled human excrement. Shukba has been a dump site for at least 20 years for construction, hospital, and factory wastes from nearby Israeli settlements like Nili and Ofarim, and from across the Green Line. High tipping fees for industrial and construction waste in Israel have encouraged Israelis to dump illegally in the West Bank, where Israeli environmental laws do not apply. Shukba is also a dump site for Ramallah area construction and demolition debris, and for hospitals sending X-ray images to be burned down for their silver, as none of these wastes are permitted, as I just mentioned, in the PA's formal landfills. Waste in Shukba is classically siege-like in that it surrounds, but it also emanates from within, from inside the village. Indeed, outward movement and blockage are two of the things that differentiate military siege from waste siege. Shukba residents have difficulty getting rid of their own wastes because of lacking infrastructures and because Israel polices or obstructs waste outward movements. The army, for example, periodically confiscates Shukba's only garbage truck. And Shukba is further burdened by accumulations of its own buildings after Israel demolishes them. Donors, for their part, deem villages of Shukba's size too small for wastewater treatment plants. Without such infrastructures, residents have little choice but to send their own excrement flowing into the ground. Dumping occurs in parts of Shukba designated Area C. The two Israeli institutions monitoring Area C's environmental issues are the Civil Administration and the Associations for the Protection of the Environment of Judea and Samaria, which are two settler organizations. But while these actors evaluate, influence the designs of, and often prohibit construction of Palestinian infrastructure projects, they have done very little to alleviate Shukba's waste-related burdens. The fact that Israel has jurisdiction over waste in Shukba will become important also in part 2 when I discuss how waste siege shapes socialities. Here I want to highlight that Shukba's waste siege is circular because Shukban's attempts to mitigate accumulation's effects redistribute rather than eradicate waste's toxicities. At a physical level, this is the case because when they burn the waste mountains to reduce their size, they release dioxins. Shukbans have high rates of cancer, skin disease, respiratory illness, miscarriage, and impotence. The circularity also reveals itself socially in that years of economic degradation and unemployment have compelled some Shukbans to invite dump trucks to dump on their lands for a small fee. Complicities with siege are central to its circularity, in fact. If waste forms an ecology, it is as much a currency with which to manage life as it is a cause of damage. Waste with nowhere to go creates ethical roadblocks, as my next example demonstrates. One of the most consistent features of Palestinian cityscapes is discarded bread. Bread bags hang off of rebar and awnings, tree branches, and fire hydrants. They rest in alcoves and inside piping. We might think of unwanted bread as the gold of the garbage world, but to extend the metaphor, it makes golden handcuffs. Bread is not only a staple food, it is considered sacred across religious and socioeconomic groups in Palestine. Its status means that bread should not be discarded. There's broad consensus on the ideal ways to treat excess bread. Highest valued is use of all bread one procures, including by making dishes like fattoush, a delicious salad you should all try. Also good but lower on the moral ladder is giving unwanted extra bread to persons in need. Below that is giving it to animals as food. But out of the question, even sinful, is throwing it away. That is, in the garbage, where it would be taken to a dump to be buried or where it could be burned. It's common for people to scrutinize, comment upon, and intervene in each other's bread-related practices as people train themselves and others to make ethical decisions vis-a-vis bread. Yet people daily find themselves in possession of unwanted bread, for a number of reasons that include changes in the modes of the occupation, the occupied economy, and what many call the collapse of the National Palestinian Movement, and which I'm happy to discuss further after the talk. Thousands of people are unable to meet the ideal standards of excess bread reuse, becoming besieged with it instead every day. Bread deposits in these images are the compromise thousands of people have come up with for managing the dilemma this poses. But, and here is the ambivalence again, hanging bread outside is a solution with concessions. Lena, a university student I spoke with, for example, takes out her household garbage every day, but she insists that her mother be the one to carry out the separate bag of bread tied off to place on the dumpster handle outside. I beg my mother to take out the bread, she told me, giggling uncomfortably in a group of other students. Lena's admission was both funny and serious. It was funny and perhaps embarrassing that she needed her mother's help to take out the trash, but it was serious in that she was genuinely apprehensive about how to dispose of bread. Discarding it could make her a sinner, damaging her sense of herself. Lena's suggestion was that her mother was compromising herself ethically each day that she hung the bread outside. I believe that the fact that many who leave bread out feel torn about it is why I almost never witnessed anyone doing it, although obviously people were doing it because it was happening as evidenced in the material form it took outdoors. It was a compromise executed in furtive, stolen moments. The person who had done it knew she had failed to treat bread ethically, possibly not for the first time, and worried that someone might catch the bread's abandonment. I'll return to the story of bread in a moment. Here I want to emphasize two things. One, that inundation by too much of a good thing, in this case bread, is another feature of waste siege, and can be understood as part of its circularity. And two, that casting bread away on public infrastructures was a compromised improvisation that always carried with it the potential to compound the compromise, whether by allowing the discarder to be seen or even just by reminding her of her failure to prevent the production of bread waste in the first place. Part two, infrastructures, the infrastructural and socialities. When I say that infrastructures are among people's improvisations for mitigating waste siege, in addition to using the popular sense of the term infrastructure, which evokes large-scale technological systems like landfills, I mean that other things, including waste itself, can become infrastructural. Valuable research on roads, oil, dams, and electric grids frames infrastructures as materials that make exchange over space possible and that connect faraway places to one another. Waste, too, can be infrastructural in the sense that it can facilitate flows, circulations, and distributions of people, goods, and ideas. Waste is an enabler. In the time that remains, I'll discuss how waste becomes infrastructural and what it helps to generate in the Palestinian context. One byproduct of Zahrat al-Finjan managers' attempts to deal with the landfill's besieging qualities was what I call landfill time. Inhabiting landfill time meant thinking in terms of a single landfill's lifespan. It extracted a temporal orientation from landfills' technical properties, for example, that landfills have expiration dates because they fill up. Landfill time anticipates change, but it also creates a suspended for now sensibility, similar to what James Fabian calls a for the time being temporality, and what Vincent Ialenti calls the long now. Thinking of landfill's period of governance as a temporary but for an uncertain Palestine, long 30-year duration, allowed people like Hamdi and Mu'tasim, who in fundamental ways were actually opposed to landfills, to square their opposition with the impossibility of managing waste otherwise. It allowed them to suspend judgment enough to see establishing landfills as national work, thereby allowing further wastes to be compressed and for circularity to continue. Landfill time also shaped governing practices. In much of the world, landfills and other waste disposal infrastructures come with efforts to shape populations' behaviors, such as recycling and environmental awareness campaigns, of which we are often objects or subjects. In Palestine, because they treated waste disposal as a practice, waste burial as a practice with an expiration date, Hamdi and Mu'tasim saw themselves as waiting to deal with trickier behavior-altering issues like awareness and recycling practices until a further date when landfills would be closer to closing. This could placate communities already aggravated by landfills and gave my PA interlocutors a sense of their own governing style as patient, beneficent, and even non-interventionist. Landfill time served as the suspended temporality then of state building while everyone waited for the state. Mr. El-Masri, Shukba's village council head, told me that he had been writing letters requesting help from various PA offices. Nothing had come of it. The PA failed to respond in part because it lacks jurisdiction, as we've said, in Area C, and because the PA police in Ramallah had needed Israeli military permission and accompaniment to traverse Area C roads, for example, to arrest Shukbans profiting from the dumping. What struck me most was that the actors to whom Shukba appealed least, in other words, the Israeli army, settlers, and international donors, were those with the greatest ability to help. Of course, you might say, why would you ask your oppressors for help? I assumed this was the logic, but Sari and others from Shukba corrected me. Shukba's council had asked for Israeli assistance with other issues like connecting homes to an electric grid and relocating an electric tower. There was something different about waste. It was generative in a different way than other infrastructural substrates like electricity and water were also generative. Sari explained that with waste, there is always someone involved, especially when its accumulations are intense, disorderly, and enduring. Waste provokes questions not only about responsibility, for instance, like the responsibility to provide energy or clean water, but also about culpability. People serve as supplements to wastes accumulated as they are in Shukba, in the sense that people are external to the waste, but are also part of its formation and thus remain attached to it. Water, by contrast, may be produced through human action, as the work of scholars like Andrea Ballestero and Jesse Barnes has shown. But as a resource perceived to be natural, water provokes fewer questions about culpability. Water can stand on its own, and waste arguably cannot. Shukba's siege was thus double, made of wastes themselves and of the muqawilin, the Arabic word used for Shukba's intermediaries who were benefiting from the dumping by allowing it to happen on their lands. It was the social rot of the muqawilin that most perturbed Sadi and his colleagues and that tied their hands. With issues of waste, Sadi said, it has to do with the muqawil. He is from the same village. I can, as a son of the village, write a letter against him or a complaint to the PA. That is acceptable, ma'qul. But that I would write a letter of complaint against him to the Israeli Authority, then you have betrayal. It was the Muqawwalin's role in Shukba's accumulations that precluded asking the military for help. I realized this was likely why, when Sadi and Mr. Al-Masri had pulled out a stack of complaint letters called Shakawi, Mr. Al-Masri had asked for my patience. Sadi had blackened some words with a marker as he had photocopied each letter. Once Mr. Al-Masri had handed me the papers, I saw that Sadi had been concealing Muqawwalin names. The council repeatedly referred to the PA's national duty to help Shukba in these letters. I call this an incomplete interpolation. Shukbans hailed PA officials into shared national belonging, attempting to trigger a sense of obligation. These interpolations were incomplete because they failed to produce their desired results. Yet they created opportunities for articulating boundaries and relationships between the PA and local governments like Shukba that the PA had created in the 1990s to carry out its vision. Some of my interlocutors called the resulting experience a shibh dawla, or phantom state. Shibh dawla describes Palestinians' experience of the PA as the governing body to which appeals are made even where the PA fails to act. It describes the unspoken acknowledgement that Israel remains sovereign, but must nevertheless be ignored, at least in matters relating to waste. Shukba's waste accumulations were infrastructural for the phantom state. Waste accumulations invite people to call upon the phantom state, and the phantom state is thus one face of toxicity. But toxicity is also what gives smell, specificity, and continuity to the phantom state. When unwanted bread hangs off of public infrastructures, it displays bread possessors' failure to do their ethical duty. Yet outdoor infrastructures like awnings do relieve people's sense of besiegedness by offering an albeit compromised way to cast bread away. Infrastructures like awnings and dumpster handles become a place for matter with no place to go, where that matter is both away and not at the same time. They also sometimes create unpredictable circulations, both of bread and of shared ways of thinking. Some people do take bread left out. While driving one day through the back streets of Albire, my friend Mustafa and I encountered a shepherd. The shepherd had stopped his goats on a stony open plot of land. Of course he took the bread he found outside, he said. He broke it into pieces and spread it across a plot just like this one. His goats loved it. Even people who said they had never taken cast-off bread said they knew why people did it. That knowing was rooted in a sense of shared ethical orientation captured by the phrase most people use to explain why there was bread in the streets in the first place. You just can't throw bread away. This is why I think we can say that bread deposits mediate urban public life, facilitating flows of people and ideas across space. Left out, bread is endowed with the power to interpolate, even if incompletely here too. It addresses an audience, hailing humans and other organisms who want or need it to take it. Because this style of bread leaving is such a pervasive phenomenon, bread informs passersby that the person who placed it there shares a sense of moral constraint around treatment of bread with others who might consider doing the same. In this sense, cast-off bread makes public locations like ledges, walls, and alcoves sites for individuals to perform care for and belonging to an imagined stranger collectivity. One of the most important ideas that this bread practice helps make circulate is that such a collectivity exists at all. My interlocutors did not view casting off bread, writing shakawi, and landfill time as political gestures. They were not gestures consciously aimed at challenging colonial subjecthood. They were ways for what James Fabian calls troubled optimists to live with waste siege that also sometimes rendered responsibility for both waste and military sieges indeterminate. Yet these imperfect improvisations should not be mistaken for signs of complacency. Improvisation implies making do, but with an emphasis on making. Social formations organized around specific cultural brokers, collectivities, temporalities, and mediators coalesce when Palestinians improvise to adapt to this emergent form of siege. In closing, I want to scale up and out from Palestine. If waste siege describes the state of stateless Palestine, it's also a metaphor for our besieged planet. It is a matter of proportions in finite space. The proportion of wastes to habitable Earth is growing. Waste siege offers a way to think about that, and the fact, for example, that radioactive materials are leaking out of nuclear power plants as we speak in Japan, France, and New York, and that such leakages, like other waste types that humans produce, like plastic bags, are outpacing the technologies for minimizing their effects. My hope is that this book makes a case for thinking of refuse and excreta, toxic and troublesome as they may sometimes be, as also animating, culturing environments for socialities, ethics, and politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You've definitely given us a lot to think about everyday practice of Palestinian living with waste, as well as of our own lives with waste. I am looking for questions, and I'm inviting them to come in. This is a slightly new platform for me, so that's why I'm hesitant. Does anybody, I have a question, but I'm gonna wait for a minute or two, and also just say again how, how interesting it is to see these topics, reframed through these anthropological analytics in such an eloquent way as well. Well, maybe I will ask a question, and I will ask a question that you kind of pitched in some ways to us. First of all, I think it's really fascinating to think about this as an ethnography of ambivalence. Oh, now there's a question coming from somebody, so I will, I'll skip to that one. Okay. From Skip Shale, regarding waste, what's the situation now in Gaza, especially the wastewater pools, one of which broke about 10 years ago, flooding human neighborhoods?
Yeah, should I take them one at a time? You think what's the best?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I would say Gaza is in a long now also with regard to waste besiegedness. In fact, in a way, it's sort of the prototype or the more intense version in some ways of the West Bank experience. I would say I don't know at this very moment what the case is. My understanding is that water is below 5% potable in Gaza as a result of sewage infrastructures not being in place, which is a result of Israeli siege not allowing the materials that are required for those infrastructures to be maintained or constructed or expanded to come into Gaza. So you have literally humans, the population growing, and meanwhile the amount of sewage growing, and there being no place for that sewage to go. Often it ends up in the ocean, and that means that it re-enters the very shallow aquifer that's only a few meters deep, if anything. So I think sewage is a very strong example, and one that we hear about a lot, but actually it'd be interesting to learn more about this municipal solid waste problems in Gaza, which are somehow less frequently captured by the media. But I would say there's no way that is in a better situation. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have two interesting questions coming in from Leah Lubit. How do you think Israeli soldiers present in the occupied territories could help the Palestinians deal with their waste, assuming we could convince them to help?
Well, it's interesting to frame it as Israeli soldiers as individuals rather than thinking in terms of the Israeli military or maybe the Israeli state or the Israeli government, which are the kind of the scales at which we can think about institutional control by Israel of the West Bank. I mean, I think it was interesting to me when I did research among a few members of the Israeli military bureaucracy that there is interest among various members of that bureaucracy in preventing waste inundation in the West Bank by and dumping in particular by Israeli companies, by industries on the other side of the Green Line. So they could ramp up their incredible, what they already have as an infrastructure of movement control. They could ramp it up and monitor those trucks that are coming in to prevent dumping. They could also use their manpower to do a major cleanup of the West Bank. That would be, I mean, now you're just asking me for like my dream list of things that could happen if we could convince someone to do it. I mean, I think that was what was so striking about Shukba, that it wasn't even imaginable to ask for Shukba to be cleaned up. It wasn't even on the horizon of the imaginable, because the kind of, because the land has essentially been turned into dump site all around the village. So the kind of effort you would need, in other words, the institutional power would be so great. And then the question would be, where would that waste go? So the Israeli military or the Israeli state would have to consider, for example, moving the waste into the landfills that have space inside Israel. But right now, there is no movement of waste from the West Bank into Israel permitted by Israel. So thank you for letting me imagine a wish list, but these are some things. And again, these are kind of, I stayed within the frame of your question, but I would say that, what we need to be doing is stepping back and thinking about how sovereignty or how full political rights would enable the management, the kind of safe and ethical management of waste for Palestinians. And something that I've been saying in these talks that I feel I should emphasize more is that the matter is also has to do with capitalism and consumerism, so it's not just a matter of finding a good place for the waste or incinerating it with higher tech infrastructures. The question is this how Palestinians would like to live their lives? And do they have the opportunity to decide how they're going to, like the economic, for example, model that they're going to follow? Or is it kind of imposed on them by a combination of Israel and the PA, which is unelected, which is another thing I've been having to emphasize a little bit more in my talks because it doesn't come up. Yeah, thank you for that question.
And the capital imposed upon them by the capitalist system, right? Yeah, as you've said, yeah.
Right, but capitalism needs its helpers. I mean, I think that's the point, that a government can decide, as we know, how much that's going to rule. And I mean, one of the things that really struck me in doing this research was just how forcefully the Palestinian Authority went ahead with the plan to turn the West Bank and Gaza into sort of consumer centers, which really, and in particular kind of consumer centers where local industry was really heavily undermined, as were recycling practices, to go to Colin's question.
Okay, so there are 3 questions here. 2 are about bread and 1 other. So let's, in 10 minutes, maybe we'll start with the one on incinerators and then do the 2 on bread. Scott Bergen is asking, can you expand on why the world community advocated for landfills instead of incinerators?
Yeah, when I spoke with representatives of the donor institutions, specifically the World Bank and the German government, it was clear to them that incinerators were off the table because they were over 10 times more expensive than a landfill was to build, and they required quite a lot of running costs, so high running costs that they worried would not be able to be absorbed by the communities, because these donor projects fund the construction of the infrastructure. Sometimes that's a grant. In the case of Zahat El-Finjan, it's not even a grant, it's a loan. But let's say they fund the infrastructure itself, then they expect the community to be able to pay for the maintenance and operation of that. So one concern they had was that communities wouldn't be able to pay. And the other concern was that Palestinians don't have the know-how and the expertise to run such a high-tech infrastructure. Landfills are considered the kind of easy, low-tech option you can put anywhere, and even a dumb, untrained person could figure out how to do it. So there was certainly a heavy condescension coming from the donors, which was then sometimes reproduced. I mean, they had written materials that circulate, that are produced sometimes by the UN, that have compilations of developing waste management in developing countries and case studies. So they would be drawing on places in Africa where they would say, oh, remember when we funded that incinerator in Nigeria and then it broke down after 2 months? We're not going to put one in Palestine. So there is also a way in which Palestine is sometimes viewed as a kind of developing country, which is interesting in its own ways. But I think these are the main motivations or demotivators for the international community. But I should say the most important thing is that I heard over and over again that the Israelis would be prohibiting incinerators even if donors were willing to build them or to fund them, because they are a combustion technology that is considered to be a security threat. I don't know if it's actually considered to be a security threat, but this is the language that was filtering out to the PA managers.
Thank you. And now 2 questions about bread. One, can you explain a little bit more about what is significant about bread, so much that throwing it away is a sin, writes Timothy Lowe. It makes me think about recent work in Jordan about bakeries and the Arabic word for bread, of course, as life in Egypt. And also from Kathy Stanton, I'm thinking about how the discarded bread compares with the bread glut in the US food systems, where much of it is basically garbage and food banks don't even want the huge amounts of surplus. This reflects the scope and overproduction of the industrialized food system here. Where do the wheat and flour that go into bread in Palestine originate? Who's baking the bread? And in a larger sense, are there upstream changes in sourcing and production influencing those downstream strategies of mitigating waste?
What wonderful questions. So the first question, I think they're sort of connected questions in a way. I would say my sense when I did the bread research, which was a kind of addendum after I did my initial PhD fieldwork, I learned that this anxiety about bread seemed to have grown with urbanization. So this goes to who's making the bread. So when people were making their own bread more often, so when people were living in rural settings and making their own bread more often, and life had a different temporality to it, they were making probably the amount of bread that they needed. So there was going to be less extra bread around. The second thing is that, and this I'm connecting to the kind of experience of humanitarian aid for Palestinians, that I understood that there used to be, or at least this is kind of the way that storytelling, people were telling stories when I was doing research, that it used to be easier to find your neighbor or your family member in your immediate vicinity and to give them your excess bread or other food were you to have excess. So there was a way in which there was a kind of social absorption, a natural, or in any case appropriate feeling, social absorption of excess food, including bread, that would then kind of make this kind of problem that we're seeing now moot. What I saw really powerfully was that people expressed a great deal of discomfort in being recipients of charity in the form of bread, for example, so that it wasn't really easy for someone who had an excess of it to then get rid of it in that way, to give it out. At the same time, there is an overproduction, you might say, or an overconsumption, overpurchasing, which may have something to do with, I think yeah, I could write a whole book about this. I mean, it may have something to do with ideas of the good life, you know, that people will purchase fresh bread every day. It may have something to do with bread subsidies that I would have to research more to tell you more about, but that it's possible to buy bread for families even when they have quite little. So people can feel that they can buy a fresh bag of bread every day, but then they're that is left over. A little bit of it is left over because they have the ability to buy it again the next day, if that makes sense. And then finally, just to bring Bruno Latour in here for anyone who's interested, it's important to think about the way that bread is stored. And despite the existence of refrigerators and freezers in most homes now, which is an option certainly for for your bread if you buy an excess of it. Generally, it's brought home in a plastic bag and then left out in that plastic bag where it is really susceptible to molding. But it's left out partly because it's going to be part of a meal at any moment. It's part of any given meal, and it's some of us who have worked in the Middle East or lived there, it can also be a utensil. So it's something that's available and therefore doesn't serve the same exact purpose as something like rice, right? Rice can't be a utensil, but bread is a utensil. So this is kind of a messy answer to why there's so much of it. But I think that the sacredness, I really want to hesitate, even though I make it sound like Palestinian beliefs in the sacredness of bread are frozen in time. I'm using the ethnographic present to bring us all into a present sense together, but it's certainly a changing practice. And I think that the sacredness and that anxiety about protecting it emerged with what we think of as like the most modern parts of life. So fast food, people, working more in cities. I think I'll stop because we have 1 minute.
Well, that was perfect timing and gives us all, time to think even more as we go off into the different parts of our days about bread. Really, really, really rich. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to Sarah Gomez, to Colin Orians, to all of you for joining us, and most especially to Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins.
Thank you all for having me and for the awesome questions. Take good care. Bye.
Thank you very much.